The longing to go on a pilgrimage is deeply embedded in human nature. Standing in the places once walked by those we hold in reverence, seeing the very locations where they were born, lived, and died, offers us a sense of mystical connection and serves as a tangible tribute to their memory. If the great figures of history have sacred sites where admirers travel from afar to pay homage, then how much more eagerly do people journey to places believed to have been touched by the divine? In the earliest days of Christianity, pilgrimages were uncommon. Early Christian belief focused more on the divinity and universal presence of Christ than on his human life, and the Roman authorities were not inclined to support travel to Palestine. Jerusalem, destroyed by Titus, lay in ruins until it was rebuilt by Hadrian as the Roman city of Aelia. Yet, Christians never forgot the sacred landscape where Christ's life unfolded. Their deep respect for the site of Calvary was so well known that Hadrian intentionally built a temple to Venus Capitolina on that very spot. By the 3rd century, the cave at Bethlehem was already familiar to many Christians. Devotees also traveled to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the site of the Ascension. Visiting these sacred locations for prayer and spiritual reward had already become a part of Christian devotion. As Christianity gained prominence, pilgrimages became more common. Emperor Constantine, in embracing the faith, supported its expansion. His mother, Empress Helena, embarked on a journey to Palestine to uncover Calvary and locate relics from the Passion of Christ. Her discoveries were honored by Constantine, who commissioned the construction of a church on the site. That church, despite centuries of change, remains the central shrine of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Pilgrims quickly began traveling to the places Helena had explored. While many left no records of their journeys, we know that by the year 333, even before the completion of Helena's excavations, a traveler from Bordeaux made his way to Palestine and documented his trip. Soon after, a determined woman recorded her pilgrimage through the Holy Land. Toward the end of the 4th century, one of the great Latin Church fathers, Saint Jerome, settled in Palestine, drawing with him a group of wealthy and noble women who had once studied under him in Italy. From his cell in Bethlehem, he welcomed a steady stream of visitors who came to honor him after visiting the sacred sites. St. Augustine, one of the most spiritually profound Western fathers, viewed pilgrimages as unnecessary or even harmful. Many of the Eastern Greek fathers shared this opinion. St. Jerome, however, while not claiming that living in Jerusalem held any spiritual benefit, argued that praying where Christ once stood was an act of faith. His perspective proved more appealing to the broader public than Augustine's. As a result, pilgrimages increased, receiving encouragement from church and imperial authorities alike. By the early 5th century, it was said that Jerusalem and its surroundings hosted as many as 200 monasteries and guest houses built to accommodate pilgrims. By the middle of the 5th century, the early enthusiasm for Jerusalem reached its peak. Empress Eudocia, daughter of a pagan philosopher from Athens, chose to settle in Jerusalem after a troubled life at the imperial court. Accompanied by devout members of the Byzantine aristocracy, she immersed herself in religious pursuits. Between composing hymns, she became an active supporter of the growing trend of relic collection. She helped lay the foundation for Constantinople's famed relic collection by sending there what was believed to be a portrait of the Virgin Mary, painted by St. Luke. Her actions inspired not only pilgrims from Constantinople, but also from the West. For centuries, the luxuries of the material world had flowed from the East. Now, religious treasures began to follow the same path. Christianity had its roots in the East, and most of the early saints and martyrs came from that region. As devotion to saints became more widespread, influential voices like Prudentius and Ennodius preached that divine help could be found at saints' tombs, and that their remains were capable of working miracles. People began to travel great distances to see sacred relics. The most important relics remained in the East. Those of Christ stayed in Jerusalem until later moved to Constantinople, while most saints' relics stayed near their original homelands. Still, lesser relics gradually made their way to the west. Eventually, even small fragments of major relics were transported westward, followed by entire major relics themselves. This religious movement further drew the West's attention to the East. The people of Langres, proud owners of a finger of St. Mamas, were naturally drawn to visit his hometown of Caesarea in Cappadocia. The nuns as Chamaliers, who possessed the bones of St. Thecla, became personally invested in her birthplace at Isaurian Seleucia. When a woman from Orient returned from her journey with the thumb of St. John the Baptist, her peers were inspired to visit his body in Samaria and his head in Damascus. Entire diplomatic missions were sometimes dispatched in hopes of acquiring such treasures. Churches in the West were increasingly named after Eastern saints or sacred places like the Holy Sepulchre, and often a portion of their income was dedicated to supporting the original holy sites from which their names were drawn. This connection between East and West was supported by ongoing Mediterranean trade. Though commerce was gradually declining due to the economic weakening of the West and disruptions like the Vandal piracy that made sea travel dangerous, contact was still maintained. Religious divisions and unrest in the East also presented obstacles. Nevertheless, in the 6th century, many Western pilgrims continued to journey eastward aboard Greek or Syrian merchant vessels. These traders not only transported goods and passengers, but also carried religious stories and updates. Because of such exchanges, Western chroniclers like Gregory of Tours remained well informed about events in the East. One record even tells of a conversation between Saint Simeon Stylites and a Syrian merchant. In this exchange, Saint Simeon inquired about Saint Genevieve of Paris and sent her a personal greeting. Despite theological disputes and political tensions among church leaders, the relationship between Eastern and Western Christians during this time remained strong and full of goodwill. The period of early pilgrimages came to a close with the Arab conquests. Syrian merchants stopped visiting the coasts of France and Italy, bringing with them goods and news. Piracy once again became a threat in the Mediterranean, and the Muslim rulers of Palestine viewed Christian travelers with suspicion. The journey grew both costly and dangerous, and the Western Christian world had little wealth to spare. Still, contact was not completely severed. Christians in the West continued to feel a deep emotional and spiritual connection to the sacred sites of the East. In 682, when Pope Martin I was accused of maintaining friendly relations with Muslims, he justified his actions by saying he sought permission to send charitable donations to Jerusalem. In 670, a Frankish bishop named Arculf embarked on a pilgrimage to the East, successfully touring Egypt, Syria, and Palestine before returning via Constantinople. The entire journey took several years and was filled with hardship. We also know of other pilgrims from this period, such as Wulfi of Rouen in Picardy and Burcaire of Monturandre in Burgundy, along with his companion Wymer. Their accounts reveal that only determined and rugged men were capable of making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem at that time. Women did not appear to attempt such journeys. The number of pilgrims began to rise during the 8th century. Some even traveled from England. In his youth, Willibald made a pilgrimage to Palestine, setting out from Rome in 722 and returning only after several difficult years in 729. By the end of the century, there seems to have been an effort to organize pilgrimages under the sponsorship of Charlemagne. He had restored order and relative prosperity to the West and established diplomatic ties with the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The hostels built with his support in the Holy Land suggest that many pilgrims visited Jerusalem during his reign, including women. Nuns from Christian Spain were even sent to serve at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. However, this wave of pilgrimage was short-lived. The Carolingian Empire declined, and Muslim pirates re-emerged in the eastern Mediterranean, while Norse raiders attacked from the west. When Bernard the Wise of Brittany visited Palestine in 870, he found the facilities built under Charlemagne still standing but empty and falling into ruin. He had only been able to travel by securing a passport from the Muslim rulers of Bari in southern Italy. The golden age of pilgrimage began in the 10th century. Over time, Arab pirates were expelled from their strongholds in Italy and southern France, and in 961, Crete was retaken from them. The Byzantine navy had already begun to assert its control over the seas, reviving maritime commerce across the Mediterranean. Greek and Italian merchant ships moved freely between ports in Italy and the Byzantine Empire and, with the cooperation of Muslim authorities, began to open trade routes to Syria and Egypt. Pilgrims could now more easily secure passage directly from cities like Venice or Bari to Tripoli or Alexandria. Still, many chose to stop first in Constantinople to view its renowned relics before continuing their journey, either by sea or overland. In Palestine, the Muslim rulers generally did not obstruct Christian travelers. On the contrary, they welcomed them, recognizing the economic benefits the pilgrims brought to the region. The improved conditions for pilgrimage had a noticeable impact on religious thinking in the West. It is uncertain when pilgrimages were first mandated as formal penance. Early medieval penitential texts recommended pilgrimages, though they rarely specified particular destinations. However, there was a growing belief that certain holy sites possessed unique spiritual power. For the pilgrim, these journeys offered not only the chance to venerate the physical relics and surroundings associated with God and His saints, fostering a mystical connection, but also the hope of receiving God's forgiveness. From the 10th century onward, pilgrimage destinations were considered especially powerful in this regard. The shrine of St. James at Compostela in Spain, that of St. Michael at Monte Gargano in Italy, the many sacred locations in Rome, and, above all, the holy sites in Palestine. These places were now far more accessible, either due to Muslim retreat or their cooperation. Yet the journey remained long and challenging. Sending a criminal away on a pilgrimage for a year or more distanced him from his crime, and the physical hardship and costs served as a form of penance. The spiritual rewards and the sacred atmosphere at the journey's end provided emotional renewal. He returned transformed. Chroniclers often make passing references to frequent pilgrimages, although the names that survive tend to be those of prominent figures. Among the high-ranking pilgrims were Hilda, Countess of Swabia, who died on her journey in 969, and Judith, Duchess of Bavaria and sister-in-law to Emperor Otto I, who made her pilgrimage in 970. Other notable pilgrims included the Counts of Ardèche, Vienne, Verdun, Arcy, Anhalt, and Gorizia. Senior church figures were even more committed. Saint Conrad, Bishop of Constance, journeyed to Jerusalem 3 times, while Saint John, Bishop of Parma, went there 6 times. The Bishop of Olivola visited in 920. Several abbots made the trip as well. These well-known pilgrims were often accompanied by groups of humble men and women whose names went unrecorded. Most of this activity stemmed from personal initiative. However, a new political and religious force was emerging in Europe. In 910, Count William I of Aquitaine founded the Abbey of Cluny. By the end of the century, Cluny had become the heart of a vast and orderly monastic network, closely aligned with the papacy. The Cluniac movement saw itself as the moral guardian of Western Christendom. Pilgrimage, in their view, was a practice worth supporting. They sought to make it more accessible and better organized. By the early 11th century, Cluny had assumed near total control over the pilgrimages to the major shrines in Spain. At the same time, they began to encourage and promote pilgrimages to Jerusalem. It was at their urging that the abbot of Stavelot traveled to the Holy Land in 990, followed by the Count of Verdun in 997. Cluny's growing influence is reflected in the large number of 11th century pilgrims from France and Lorraine. While there were still many German pilgrims, including the archbishops of Trier and Mainz and the Bishop of Bamberg, and a steady stream of English pilgrims, those from France and Lorraine became dominant. The 2 powerful dynasties of northern France were both close allies of Cluny, despite their rivalry. Both supported journeys to the east. Fulk Nerra, the fierce Count of Anjou, went to Jerusalem in 1002 and returned twice more. Duke Richard III of Normandy sent charitable gifts to the Holy Land, while Duke Robert personally led a massive pilgrimage there in 1035. These events were all faithfully recorded by the Cluniac historian, the monk Glaber. The Normans eagerly followed the example set by their dukes. They held a deep reverence for Saint Michael, and large numbers of them undertook pilgrimages to Monte Gargano. From there, the more adventurous among them would continue their journey to Palestine. By the middle of the 11th century, they made up such a significant and passionate portion of the pilgrims traveling to Palestine that the authorities in Constantinople, upset by Norman incursions into Byzantine territory in Italy, began to treat the pilgrim movement with suspicion. Their Scandinavian relatives displayed a similar fervor. Scandinavians had long visited Constantinople and were captivated by its riches and splendor. Back home, they spoke of the city with awe, even equating it at times with Asgard, the mythical home of the gods. By 930, Norse warriors were already serving in the emperor's army. Early in the 11th century, their numbers had grown large enough to form the renowned Varangian Guard. Many of these Varangians developed the custom of journeying to Jerusalem during their leave. The earliest known instance was a man named Kolskegr, who was in Palestine in 992. Harold Hardrada, the most celebrated of the Varangians, made his pilgrimage in 1034. Throughout the 11th century, numerous Norwegians, Icelanders, and Danes spent years in imperial service, then made pilgrimages to Jerusalem before returning home, enriched by their savings. Inspired by their stories, friends and relatives often traveled south solely for the pilgrimage. Thorvald Kudranson Vidforli, known as the Apostle of Iceland, visited Jerusalem around 990. Some Norse pilgrims even claimed to have seen Olaf Tryggvason, Norway's first Christian king, in Jerusalem following his mysterious disappearance in 1000. Olaf, too, intended to follow in his predecessor's footsteps, but his journey remained only a legend. Many of these Nordic nobles were men of violence, often guilty of murder and in search of spiritual atonement. Sweyn Godwinson, who was half Danish, led a group of Englishmen to Jerusalem in 1051 as penance for a killing. He died of exposure in the Anatolian mountains the following autumn, having made the journey barefoot as a sign of repentance. Lagman Gudrodsson, the Norse king of Man, who had murdered his brother, also sought God's forgiveness through pilgrimage. A typical route favored by Scandinavian pilgrims was a circuitous one. In the 10th century, pilgrims from the west were primarily forced to journey by sea across the Mediterranean to reach Constantinople or Syria. However, sea travel was expensive and available space was limited. In 975, the rulers of Hungary embraced Christianity, opening up an overland route that followed the Danube and crossed the Balkans into Constantinople. This path remained perilous until 1019, when the Byzantine Empire secured control over the entire Balkan region. After that, pilgrims could travel safely through Hungary, enter the Byzantine Empire at Belgrade, and continue through Sofia and Adrianople to the imperial capital. Another option was to travel to Byzantine-controlled southern Italy, then take the short sea crossing from Bari to Dyrrhachium, and follow the ancient Roman via Egnatia through Thessalonica to the Bosphorus. From there, 3 well-established roads led across Asia Minor to Antioch. The route continued down to the coast at Latakia and into Fatimid territory near Tortosa. This was the only border pilgrims had to cross after arriving at Belgrade or Tamoli, and from that point, they could proceed without further obstacles to Jerusalem. Although overland travel was slower than going by sea, it was far less costly and more convenient, particularly for those traveling in large groups. As long as pilgrims behaved respectfully, they could generally rely on warm hospitality from the peasants throughout the Byzantine Empire. Along the early stages of the journey, the Cluniac order had begun establishing hostels to assist travelers. In Italy, there were several hospices, some designated specifically for Norse pilgrims. A large and important hospice was located at Melk in Austria. In Constantinople, Western pilgrims were welcomed at the Hospice of Samson, and the Cluniacs also maintained a facility in Rodosto, situated in the outskirts of the city. In Jerusalem itself, accommodations were available at the Hospital of St. John, founded by merchants from Amalfi. Western nobles often traveled with armed escorts, which was acceptable provided the soldiers remained disciplined. Many pilgrims sought the safety of traveling with such groups, although journeying alone or in small numbers was not unusual, nor especially dangerous. At times, however, there were complications. During periods of persecution under Hakim, it became uncomfortable to remain in Palestine for extended periods, though the influx of pilgrims never fully ceased. In 1055, the frontier leading into Muslim-controlled territory was considered unsafe. Lietbert, the bishop of Cambrai, was denied permission to exit Laodike by the local governor and was forced to detour to Cyprus. A year later, in 1056, Muslim authorities barred Westerners from entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and expelled around 300 of them from Jerusalem. There were also incidents that caused offense within the Byzantine Empire. Both Emperor Basil II and his successor, Empress Theodora, incurred criticism for directing customs officials to impose taxes on pilgrims and their horses. In response, Pope Victor II wrote to the Empress in late 1056, urging her to revoke the decree. His letter implied that imperial tax collectors were even operating in Jerusalem itself. Despite these occasional setbacks, such disruptions were uncommon. Throughout most of the 11th century, until its final decades, a continuous flow of travelers headed east. These pilgrims came in groups that sometimes numbered in the thousands, ready to spend a year or more on the journey in the unhurried spirit of the time. Many would pause in Constantinople to marvel at the immense city, which dwarfed anything they had seen in the West, and to venerate the sacred relics it held. Among the treasures were the crown of thorns, the seamless garment, and many of the Passion's most revered relics. Pilgrims could behold the cloth from Edessa bearing the image of Christ's face, a portrait of the Virgin attributed to St. Luke, the hair of John the Baptist, the mantle of Elijah, and the bodies of countless saints, prophets, and martyrs. From there, the pilgrims would journey on to Palestine, visiting sacred sites such as Nazareth, Mount Tabor, the River Jordan, Bethlehem, and the numerous shrines in Jerusalem. At each stop, they prayed and paid their respects. Afterward, they undertook the long return trip, spiritually uplifted and transformed. Upon arriving home, they were honored by their communities as pilgrims of Christ who had completed the holiest of voyages. However, the pilgrimage experience relied on two essential conditions. First, there needed to be peace and stability in Palestine to ensure the safety of unarmed travelers. Second, the route to the Holy Land had to remain accessible and affordable. These requirements depended on two major factors: good governance and order in the Muslim world, and the continued prosperity and goodwill of the Byzantine Empire.